1, 2, test.
Okay, ready? Yes? We go? So it's probably one of the best improvements we have done on Odoo 13 is the new framework and especially the performance we have in the new framework. And in my opinion, it's the biggest refactoring we have done since version 8. So it's massive in terms of impact for our users. You know, in version 8, it's when we released the new framework style. This is the next generation of the new framework that we'll present you with Odoo 13. We call it an in-memory ORM because we do much more in memory than before. So you have seen the statistics of that Tony showed you. It's much faster because we worked on the performance in Python, but also in SQL. On average, on all the operations we measured, it's 4.5 faster, but it depends on the operation. Like reading 2,000 partner, you see here, creating 5 partner. The slowest gain we had was create and post an invoice, but it's not. It was not because of the framework. It's because the new invoice mechanism. We create the journal entry when we create the invoice and when we post it for the currency information. So the job was not comparable, both, but really the impact of the ORM is much bigger than that. Like if you modify a sale order line, you know, when you modify a price on the sale order line, he has to recompute the tax on the line, the subtotal on the line, goes back on the sale order, but the revenue on the sale order, and if the sale order is linked to an opportunity, has to update the expected revenue on the opportunity. So all those mechanics, when you modify now a sale order line, it's close to 10 times faster than what we had in Odoo 12. So pretty much every operation, every operation we measured was much faster. It was also the case in terms of SQL. So it's a relative graph, so it's not in milliseconds here. It's a relative, red is Odoo 13 and the blue is Odoo 12. So you see how many queries there were, 12 versus 13. And one operation, the read, is actually the same before and after the new framework. So you have seen here the performance is much better because for the read, the gain has been in the optimization of the Python code. But for all other operations, the most of the gain we get were from simplifying the ORM, more in the sense than reducing the number of things to do, and the things to do also, the SQL queries were part of the things to do. So every time we had SQL queries, probably because we had a search or a write to generate this query. So as these things have been reduced, we save a lot of time. And this graph is also more important because everything we measured here was on an empty database or with a limited number of records. But you know, the more we grow the number of records on the database, the slower it gets because of the SQL. The Python code is constant, doesn't change. But if you have a large database, the time of the SQL starts to increase. And as the number of SQL reduced a lot on large database, we didn't check yet, but we think that the impact in terms of time on large database will be probably much bigger than what you see here. Because the number of SQL queries for most of the operations have been reduced by 4, 5, or 6 times less, which means less log, less concurrency, less everything. Okay? Okay. We like to do demos at Odoo. So here I have Odoo 12, and here I have Odoo 13. So let's do something. Let's create a partner. Okay. So I will explain after. We have two things. We know when we create a partner. Let's measure it with the flush. We explain the flush after. So time it measures in terms of milliseconds how much time it takes to create a partner. It launches a lot of times. So here it did 7 times 100 partners to create. And the average it gets is 7.37 milliseconds to create a contact, like a customer. Okay? Let's do the same in 12. There is no flush mechanism in 12. Here it's 47 milliseconds. So we went from 47 to 7.37. So it's like 7 times. So 7 times faster. And what you see here, you will see on pretty much every object. It's on the creation, but you will have the same impact on writing. For reading, I can show you after also, it's very fast when you browse the record. On the read itself, the speed is not that, the advantage is not that big, but on browsing the record, like computing file fields, it's much faster. Before going further, I'll explain you how it works. So the first thing we did is to simplify the cache. For those who know the ORM, so my talk is a little bit technical. If you are not developer, it's better that you leave and go to another talk. It's not that we don't like you, but So you know, before in Odoo 12, in Odoo you had one cache per environment. So every time you were doing self with context, you were creating a new environment. If you were doing sudo to perform as a root, to perform your code as a root, you were creating a new environment. In version 12, we created one cache per environment, because as a root, the computed field may have a different value than a regular user. But actually, most of the fields are stored in a database. And if the field is stored in the database, it means it only has one value, the value of the column in Postgres. So most of the fields do not need to have a cache per environment. So what we did in version 20 is to have one cache only, global, for all the environment, with an exception of some fields which are context dependent. So we have a new attribute at depends context to say that this field depends on the cache. Like a multi-lang field will depend on the language. Or like the inventory on the product, the number of stock available on the product depends on the warehouse we are, the context of the warehouse we are. The difference is that in Odoo 12, when you were reading a field, you get a select in the database. And then you were changing the context to say I'm working for this warehouse. When you read the same field, you have another select in the database. And when you do sudo, because you need to access something when you need specific access right, you are also doing some select in the database, plus creating a new cache. Okay? In version 13, when you read this field, you have a select, and then all this operation does nothing else than just reading a cache. It seems simple, but actually the business code, we're passing through all the fields all the time. You know, when you create a sale order, you create different lines. Every time you create a line, it has to recompute the total of the sale order. And so you are passing across all the same thing all the time. And simplifying the cache that way reduced a lot the memory, but also the number of access to the database to read. And when you have a select, it probably means that you have a read, and so you will also have the overhead of the Python code. The next thing we did is to prefer everything. We try to do everything in memory. In version 12, when you read a field, you have a select. When you write a field, you have an update. In version 13, everything is done in memory. So it's still Postgres, store the data, but during the transaction, we try to do everything in memory. We try because sometimes it's not possible, but I would say 99% of the time it's performed in memory. So when you do this in the 12, you assign test to a field, you have an update plus a cache invalidation. You do that, you assign another value, you have an update on cache invalidation. You read the field, you have a select in the field. So it's pretty time consuming. Now in Odoo 13, when you assign the field, you put in cache, nothing in the database, it's just in cache, just a set underscore set in Python. When you put a new value, it puts in cache too. When you read the field, it gets from the cache. And that's what I introduced you in my comparison. When you flush, then it will write what's in the cache in the database. Okay? So we do everything in memory, and we write only when we flush the data. And then we have to manage all the dependencies. The dependencies are extremely complex in Python. It's a computed field that depends on the field, because it's not only depends on the field, but it depends on other objects. It goes from one to many, lit one, object. Like the total on the sale order depends on the sum of the price of the line, but also the discount on the line, and the subtotal on the line, and so on, and the tax, etc. So I have a minimal object class here with an object order and some line order lines. Okay? And I have on my order a global discount and multiple lines, and I have a total on my order. And on my lines, I have a price and a subtotal, which is the price multiplied by the global discount. Just this object is quite complex because the line depends on the discount, which is on the sale order, and the total of the sale order depends on the sum of the line. So every time you change one of these fields, you have to recompute the rest to be sure there is a consistency. So what we do, we recompute what should be changed, and not like it was the same thing in 12. So when you change a value, like here, order the discount 10, it will look for all the lines of this sale order to update their subtotal, because it changed. So it will perform a select just to know what are the lines of this sale order that I will have to update later on. And then it updates the order. In Odoo 13, when you do that, it will not do a select to check which line should be impacted. It will read the invert one to me. So because it depends on the order ID, it will read the line IDs
on the sale order to have the list of lines that it should update. And because you probably modified or did read this document before, usually business logic perform on the same data, it's probably in memory. And because it's in memory, there is no select to know which are the lines attached to the sale order. So when you do that, it performs 0 query. You go to the sale order, you change the discount, it marks every field to be updated, and it does not even compute this field. It just said this field has to be recomputed later on. So if you try to read it, please recompute it. But it doesn't do it now, because maybe we'll have the ability to group the recomputation before. After. And if you do an update, then it performs everything, you write on the database with an update, if you do it. So what we do also, we delay computed field. The mechanism was already existing in the preceding version with speed triggers on the stock field and sort triggers. You know how we manage that, the dependencies. But before it was per line. So we were, when you do line.product quantity equal 1, we actually compute what should be changed, because this field changed what are the dependencies that should be invalidated. And after the transaction, we recompute them and then we write in the database. But in Odoo 12, it was doing that at every statement. So here it was marking to recompute, recomputing, and then writing in the database. Marking to recompute, recomputing, marking to recompute, recomputing. And if you had 10 lines in your sale order, it was doing always the same, recomputing the total of the sale order 10 times. Actually, not 10 times, because it depends on the discount and on the price 20 times. Okay? In version 13, if you do that, it just says, okay, I have to, because I changed the quantity and the discount, I have to mark the total of the sale order as invalid. So if someone reads it, I will have to recompute it, but I don't recompute it now. We delay the recomputation of the field. So we just mark to recompute all the dependencies. So the total of the order, we mark. And at the end of the transaction, when we flush, then we recompute all the fields, then we write in the database. Okay? So everything is performed in memory, and we delay the recomputation of the field later on. Why? Because first you only have to compute one time the total of the order at the end of the transaction, or if someone wants to read it before, first. And secondly, when you group the computation, let's say I'm working on 100 orders, it's much faster to compute the total of 100 orders because all the transactions are performed in batch. All the reads are in batch, all the computations are in batch, rather than computing 100 times one order. In version 12, it was doing that. 100 times one order. Now it marks everything to recompute, end of the transaction, it computes the 100 orders at the same time. Clear? So we also delay the SQL update. So we mark the fields to recompute it, we recompute them if you need them, but we do the same for the delay. So if we recompute a field, and let's say when I change the state of the line, he has to change the state of the order. In version 12, every time I do an assignation, there is the update in the database. In version 13, it just put in the cache. Maybe if someone wants to read it, he will read from the cache. It's only when you flush that he will update everything at once. The good thing is that if you create 100 sale order or quotation, you have only one update to set draft on the state of your 100 quotation, instead of doing 100 updates in SQL per quotation. As we delay the update in the database, we can group and optimize the update and write all the data at once. Okay? And then we have optimization of the dependency tree. That's quite complex, but imagine a sale order. When you change the data on a sale order, let's say you change the price list on the sale order, it can impact the line, because the price depends on the price list. So the line will be different, the subtotal of the line will be different, but then the total of the order, you come back to the order, is different because it's the sum of the line of the sale order. So you are going to sale order, check all the lines of this sale order, and then for all of these lines, find the order again, and come back to the order. So that was a waste of time. So now that we have a clean dependency tree in Odoo 13, what we did is to optimize the dependency tree. Means if I change the price list, I know that the total of the order will be changed. Not directly, because it depends on the line, the total depends on the line, but indirectly, because we did our computation when we started the database, the registry actually. that there is there is an indirect dependency between the price list I changed and the total. My example is very bad because the price list is an unchanged. It's not a compute for the ones who follow me, but imagine it's a compute in my example. And it was very costly because going from the order lines to the order is actually very bad because for each of the line you have to come back to the same order. So sometimes you have to read 100 lines to read the order ID field to find that this order's total should be improved, it should be recomputed. And that's very bad because this, for each line that you have to come back to the order, was very time consuming. Okay? So in order 13, the dependency tree is in memory, like before, but instead of having recursive code, who says, okay, I change the price list, it should change the price on the line, you should change recursively the total on the line, then come back to the order and change the total. Instead of doing that recursively, we have a dependency tree on all the fields. When I change this field, I should impact this one. So we then have to go from the order, back to the line, go back to the because we optimize the dependency tree when we launch the registry. Clear? Browse. We did some improvement in the browse too. The main we did was to avoid multiple cache conversion. You know, we have different, in memory, we have different format for the browse. When you do a read of a many to one, it's different than the browse, because the browse gives you a record. A read will give you the tuple ID and name, or name, depending on what you read, if you read a many to one. And you also have the value in memory, in the cache, was usually a tuple of IDs. Okay? We changed that. We changed the format of the cache so that the format of the cache reflects the format of the database. And then reading from the database, putting it in cache, it's much faster because first Odoo prefetch the fields. So even if you read one field, he will read 20 fields for you because he knows that most probably he will read other fields later on. So if these fields are not high, doesn't require a lot of computation to read, I will read more fields because I'm pretty sure that the code will need them later on. So as you prefetch, and sometimes you prefetch in number of records too, sometimes you have a lot of records and a lot of fields to put in cache. But if the format is different, what you have to do in Python is for every record, for every field, call a conversion method. But Python is extremely slow. Python is when you do that, it's extremely slow. If you do it with just assigning a dictionary that you receive from Postgres that you assign in the cache, it's much faster because you can use the C implementation of the dictionary in Python and put the data directly in the cache because it has the same format. We change the cache so that it has the same format of the database so that we limit the conversion. Of course, after you might still have a conversion from the cache to the actual read or to the browse, but that we reduce from the database to the cache, which is the most used one because of the prefetch and everything goes through that. So when you read a field in Odoo 12, you have a prefetch, then a read, then an underscore read, and a SQL query. We convert to cache, we put in cache, we get from cache. That was also a bit stupid. We were putting in cache, getting some cache, formatting for the read. It was a read in Odoo because we wanted to put in cache, and the cache had not the same format. So we were doing 3 conversions just to make a read, the high-level read method. In Odoo 13, if you do a browse, for instance, where you read a field, but reading memory, so more like get, you have the prefetch, the low-level read, mainly for the high-level read, because you do a get, not a read. Of course, you have the SQL query to get it up. We put it in cache, and that's it. We also did a lot of cleanup in the Python code, because Python costs a lot, so I explain you with the cache, there have been a lot of small details like that that improve the memory, optimization. So let's have a look. To understand the new framework, the best way to look at it is to look at what's happening at the SQL level. Okay? So we'll see when we do something in SQL, what's happening. So I'll go to version 12. I just learned yesterday that there is an argument to avoid that. Log SQL instead of doing log level. I don't like this syntactic sugar stuff. Okay. So the first one, I will create a partner. Don't look at the first one because the first one, it loads the registry. So you have extra queries because of the registry. I did one for nothing. Now let's have a look at what's happening when I create a partner. You see the number of queries? It seems very bad, but actually it's not very bad. It's because there are a lot of dependencies in ERP. When you create a customer, maybe there are opportunities that could be linked to this customer. Actually, they are not, but they could be. Or invoice, or the computed data, like the display name, which depends on the name, the commercial partner ID that depends on the partner. So if you have a look at what's happening when I create, you have the insert. That's good. That's something you cannot avoid. The insert in the database. And then he's looking if invoice exists for this customer, because if we change the name of the customer, there is probably a related field from the invoice to the customer that says, because we changed the name of another field, or the fiscal position, or what, I don't know what that field, I probably have to update my invoice too. So you check if there is invoice related to this customer to update them. Then you check if there is another partner that links for the commercial partner ID. So you check if a subsidiary or a company of a partner. And it does a lot of tests like that for all the dependencies. And then it just create an attachment. And most of the selects are for that purpose. You see here, there are some insert that you cannot avoid, and update that you cannot avoid, like here, inserting to add the followers. When we create a partner, you, the one who created the partner, become a follower of the partner. That's not something you can avoid. And then check if the followers have to be notified. And then there are some properties. You read there is the property because the customer inherits from the property of the company. Let's say the account receivable. It's defined as a default in the property field. It's with the company. So we read the property to display it on the screen. Even though I can display it on the screen there. And when I create, we check, we compare if it's the same value. If it's the same value, we will not create a property because it will use the default. But it's a bit stupid. We could have avoided that in creation. So here are the SQL queries you have when you create a customer. Let's do the same in Odoo 30. Yeah. So don't look at the first time because there is a registry. Now I create the partner. You can pause. It's mostly perfect. Means there is only insert queries. So only the necessary. So what it does, it creates a contact, it creates the followers, it creates the link to the followers and the subtype, what kind of thing is following. It creates a message, you know, the small message, this record has been created at that time. And that's it. Only the insert. But something is missing. You know, on the partners, on the Rust underscore partner object, there are a few computed fields. One of them is the commercial partner ID, who is the main company of this company. And if it doesn't have a parent, it's itself. The other one is the display underscore name, who is computed generally based on the name of the company. It's the name we display in the minute one, like the result of the name get. It's actually the opposite, but it's that. And you see there, they are not. These fields are not there. The computed value are not in the set because it did not compute it yet. But if I flush, it will flush and recompute all the missing fields and write them to the database. Oh, more than expected. You have one select, another one, I don't know why, probably something, because of phone number sanitization mechanism. And then you have two updates. Okay. I had two records because I did two creation and I didn't flush the first one. So it flushed all at once. That's the good thing. So it updates both at once, but as they have different values, he's still forced to do two updates instead of one. So I have actually two records in one here. So it's actually just one select and one update to create my company. And here in the update, you have all the computed fields. Like the phone sanitize, it checks the phone number you record, and it computes a sanitized one, like you have the prefix of the country, plus 32. You have the computed field like email normalized, normalization of the email, commercial partner ID, who is the main parent company of this company, the display name, which is the name of the same of the name of the company, and all those fields are written at once instead of a lot of different updates before. sometimes before he was trying to optimize. So sometimes you have one update for several things, but not always. Here it's most of the time, at least every time you flush. And if you read data now, if I say I create a new partner, okay, he created my partner, and then I read the name of the partner. It does nothing, it just look at the cache. Before, if I create a new partner, I have 80 queries, and then I read the field of this partner. He's in cache, but what use case could I have? Sudo. I even forgot how it was working in version 12. Is it sudo like that? I was already admin, but if I change to another user, usually you don't work as admin, you work as a demo user, I would have extra SQL queries just to read the field, which would not have been the case. So I could say with context. So it's on self. Okay, but you get my point. So now when you change things, so if I do p.name equal fp2, fp3, there is a flush somewhere that we forget to remove. Okay, you have less query than before. There is probably still a flush somewhere in one of the modules that inherits and compute, but normally we try to avoid every flush if possible. But still, it's only 2 minimal queries for an update. You see, there is no update. Huh? The update, if I change the name fp234, I have no update. It's only when I do flush that then it will write fp4 in the display name. Okay? Let's check with the other one. So I create a partner, let's clear. I create a partner, and then I change the name. I read the name, sorry. It's in cache, fortunately. If I change the name, you have lots of select and update. If I change it again, and again, instead of flushing at the end. We have done lots of optimization like that. We have no filter domain, but I think you'll talk about it. What time is it? 2 minutes? I'm done. Perfect. Tu continues là, hein? Ouais. I think I will skip the questions and answer because you will have more information about. So I explained the basic of the principle of how the framework works and the impact of this framework. And now Raphael will tell you how you should adapt your module because what you thought was good optimization before are not relevant today. We had fun things like we had some optimization in the code, like we did SQL queries to group things. And now when we looked at the new framework, these optimization in the code were actually anti-optimization now. So the way to optimize the code completely switched because what was slow before is fast now. And the other thing now that could be a bit slower than not what before, but another way of doing it. So Raphael will explain you how you can adapt your module and what are the impacts. But before that, I think he will talk about the on-change method. So in addition to the speed, we also improve the design architecture of the framework to make it more abstract, I would say. Method. So in addition to the speed, we also improve the design architecture of the framework to make it more abstract, I would say. method. So in addition to the speed, we also improve the design architecture of the framework to make it more abstract. Method. So in addition to the speed, we also improve the design architecture of the framework to make it more abstract. Method. So in addition to the speed, we also improve the design architecture of the framework to make it more abstract.
My name is Raphaël Collet. I'm one of the guys behind this important refactoring of the ORM. The thing I will say is most of the changes are actually just on the implementation of the ORM and are, for most of them, not even visible to the API. Okay? And actually, the impact on your code is usually pretty small. That's the first message you have to see. The other thing I'd like to say, it's not just 1 or 2 months' work. Fabien, who just presented, actually initiated the change. He didn't convince me at first. Actually, he had to work hard to convince me. And then once we were convinced, I worked quite some time with Denis and Toufik. So there were 3 of us for almost full-time 1 month, just trying to make it work. And we eventually made it really work. Okay, so I'm one of the developers, and I'm also the leader of a small team. That's the ORM team. And that's also the team that manages the run bot and these things. Okay. The initial idea Fabien had in mind was actually not at all about refactoring the ORM for some reason. It was about a small change, and it was about using compute methods as an alternative for on-change methods. It was just that in the beginning. And then when he started trying to implement something, he saw opportunities for making things, implementing things differently, and differently in a way that you could optimize much more stuff. So most of the changes I'm going to show you here, some of them are just to make your program easier, and the rest is actually just for performance, which is tremendously important in our cases. The first thing I will talk to is mention, Fabien didn't even mention it, is something I made several months ago. I introduced something called a Superuser mode. Some partners have actually already implemented something like that, and that was called a kind of bypass access rights checks. Essentially, this is a blessed version of this work. The idea is every time you sudo, you use the method sudo, you're facing at least 2 problems. The very first problem is a traceability issue. Every time you sudo, you will end up with records being modified by the administrator, the user 1. And essentially, you have no clue who actually initiated that modification on a given record. So you've lost some kind of traceability. And the second thing, which is sometimes a nightmare, if you haven't put enough stuff in the context to say what company you are working in, I mean, from the point of view of what are you trying to do, like you're creating accounting entries and you want to say in which company you want to introduce this company. If you don't put enough information in the context, and there's a sudo coming in between, you'll end up creating stuff for the company of the super user, which might have nothing to do with the company of the actual user trying to do something. And facing this thing, we have done a few things, like essentially trying to almost never use the super user, the super user, and to tackle the problem of bypassing the access right checks. We kind of created a kind of a superhero mode for every user. So every user has a normal mode and a super user mode. The super user mode cannot be reached from the user interface. It's a purely programmatic thing, okay? And essentially, the super user mode gives you a shortcut for not checking access rights. But you keep the same user ID, therefore you have that traceability, and there's no longer any confusion between like the current user's company, because it's still the same user, okay? So you will never end up with someone else's company in your code, okay? More technically speaking, I'll go very fast. Essentially, you already have on your environment object, there's a UID, which is the current user ID, and there's an extra flag called SU, SU standing for super user. And the change is that essentially both the user ID and the SU flag are mostly independent, okay? And therefore, what I changed is the sudo method no longer changes the user, it actually changes the flag, the super user flag. And so in the example here, on that side, see my, you can see. In Odoo now, so this is a regular record created by any request, whatever. So assuming you have your user ID 42, it's not in super user mode. Here I create a sudoed record set corresponding to foo. The user ID is still the same, but this time the super user flag is actually on. And this is used now systematically when you have to check access rights. We don't rely anymore on being the user ID 1 or the super user ID. We rely actually on the super user mode. And there's just a little trick, is that if there's an extra method called with user, it's really for switching the user. So when you switch to a different user, you switch to an environment with that user, with not in super user mode, except for user 1, which is always in super user mode. Okay? And I think that's a much cleaner framework for programming. One thing I've changed as well, when you're recomputing fields, especially fields that need to be recomputed to be stored, there was now and then some issue because I'm clicking on a button, confirming something or whatever on a document, and this causes directly or indirectly some other fields I've never heard of being recomputed, trying to be stored, and the ORM saying, no, you don't have the right to store that field. And the solution to that was to say, okay, when you recompute that other field, you do it as the superuser. Then, I mean, recomputing a side field is no longer a problem. Here, you still get that thing. It's the default. So the default is always to recompute as superuser, except it's not as the superuser, it's as the user in superuser mode. So you keep traceability without having access right issues that may prevent to perform the operation. And usually recomputing a field is not something you want to prevent. Okay. So I'm gonna come back on the cache. I'll be very quick. So essentially we made less indirections in the cache. And the idea is the cache just reflects what's in the database. Essentially that leads to less cache miss. That's just the basic idea behind that. However, this thing has an impact, is that sometimes you may have cache inconsistencies because there's, let's say, only one value in cache, and actually the value may be depending on the user or the context. So the first point is the value may be different depending on the user. Either the value actually depends on the user, and essentially if you fall on that situation, typically you are responsible for invalidating the cache manually and then rereading the cache with the right environment. Okay? But actually switching users is not very common. It happens, but actually most of the time, at least in Odoo 12, when you switch the user, usually the user you want to switch to is the superuser, and it's just for bypassing access rights, right? So switching to another user than the superuser, most of the time doesn't make sense. It sometimes makes sense, but not all the time. So, and when you're doing stuff with two different users, the other thing you may encounter is that, for instance, one of the users can access some fields and another user cannot access some fields. In Odoo 12, I was putting special values in the cache to flag the field as, oh, access denied, something like that, or access right error, access error. What we're doing now is that if you cannot read a field, it's just not put in cache. But the trick is, if you try to read a field and somehow someone else has read it before you and could read it, you will simply have a cache hit and you'll just get the value in cache. So sometimes a non-privileged user may access the cache after a privileged user has prefetched the value in the cache. This may happen. However, I mean, we've been implementing this model for several months, and we haven't found yet like some big breach, security breach in the code. Most of the time, when you're doing something as a super user, you have already checked many things as a regular user. And therefore, when you switch to super user, it's essentially in kind, like you've made a bunch of checks and you're just crossing the fence and saying, now we go straight to the point. Okay, but this may happen. Just keep it in mind, and well, most of the time you'll figure it out when you have to typically do many things as sudo and non-sudo, that it may happen. I think the right way to do things is to try to do as much as possible not in super user mode, and then switch to super user mode only when it's necessary. And that's typically the thing. There's something, so for all the fields that are stored in database, that's the only thing you have to know. For the fields that are not stored, and this happens for usually computed fields, they may depend on a key in the context. It also happens for stored fields. For instance, the translated fields, they depend on the language that you put in the context, right? For those cases, we have made a special attribute on the field and a decorator for setting that attribute. It's called depends context. There was a key called context dependent. And essentially, it means the whole context counts as a kind of an indirection key in the cache. Now you specify exactly what you depend on. So you specify the context key. It's usually a string that you depend on. In the example here, this is a stupid example, but essentially it shows you the idea. So I'm computing a field called bar here that depends on the field foo, and essentially it sums foo with some extra strings, and the extra string is actually given in the context. And the way you make the ORM manage this correctly is to tell the ORM this field depends on the key extra in the context. Okay? And that's mostly it. So you have the decorator. Most of the cases where we had to put this dependency is for computed fields. The other case was translated field. But for translated, you just say you translate it and it just works. Okay? Otherwise, it's usually for a computed field, and when the field is computed, you use the decorator depends context, and we put it on the compute method because that's typically where in the code of the compute method you have the access in the context. Okay? You have two special keys, in fact, for this depends context. If you really want a field that depends on the user ID, you put UID as a context key. It's actually not a context key. There's a special hack. When you compute the actual key, when we say UID, then we'll get the user ID and its superuser flag. And company, it means it depends on the main company of the user or the main company in the context. I'll tell more about this env than company later, but essentially this is what corresponds to force company. For instance, if you want to access company dependent fields, you have to set force company in the context. And env.company is the same concept. Okay? Just coming back on these delayed updates. So the idea, the write method does not perform in fact, the method flush works more or less like the former method recompute, which still exists. So if you say flush without a parameter, it will take all the updates for all the models, group these updates to try to generate a minimal number of update queries for Postgres, for the database, okay? A typical example is you create a record on that record. Essentially, flush will force the recomputation of all those fields, and then typically will make, at worst, one update per record with all the fields that have changed value. Okay? The guarantee of the flush is to generate actually one query per modified record, maximum one. There are better cases where you have just one field or two fields being recomputed on several records. If they all have the same value, you'll typically generate one update for all those records. Flush is automatically called by the ORM methods, like search. Search will perform a select in the database, Of course, this requires the data to be in the database for the select to be correct. So search will automatically flush, read will automatically flush, read group will automatically flush, and so on. Just before committing the transaction, there's an automatic flush as well. This is built in, actually. We changed the code so that it always tries to flush before committing. Most of it is invisible for the programmer. The only visible part is something like this. When you do an explicit query manually on a table, and that query depends on the values of some fields on several models. And here I added a call to flush. Whoops, sorry. I had a call to flush, so I could have called just flush without a parameter. It would just flush everything that's pending. Or I could flush and give a list of field names, and then it would only flush these fields if they have some, it will actually flush, check that whether there's something to recompute or to be stored for these fields, and if there is, it will take all the pending corresponding updates for those records and flush them. Okay, so the flush there essentially is make sure that those fields of the model of self are in the database. Okay, that's pretty easy. So we've been a bit by trial and error, tracking all the manual SQL queries we had in our code and added a bunch of flush just before. And that's it. That's just it. Okay. Fabien mentioned the recomputations, which are by default now delayed. Before, they were recomputed and stored as fast as quick as possible. So that was the way the Odoo 12 worked. Now we kind of switched the heuristics and say the default is try to delay as much as possible and recompute later, on demand, essentially. So every time you modify something, a certain number of records fields depend on it, they're marked to be recomputed, and that's it. If you access those fields marked to be recomputed, they will be computed, but not stored yet to the database. Okay? And so essentially the method recompute processes all the pending recomputations. Those recomputations will prepare updates. They don't store themselves that right away. They prepare updates. And then the method flush can flush these updates in the database. Can push these updates to the database. I'd recommend don't use manually the method recompute. Most of the time, if you just want to access a field on a record, it works right away. And if you want to access the field in the database for some reason, because you make an explicit query or something, use flush. Okay, so recompute should no longer be used in your code. Okay, the right method now is flush. That's it. Here it's Fabien already mentioned it. I will re-explain it once, and I tried to get a different way to explain it, let's say. So what we've done first is when you touch a field, you determine what depends on it. What depends directly on it, but also what depends on what is depending on it. So you essentially, you say, when I modify A, there's a field B to be computed here, and there's a field C that depends on B, and so on. So what we do is we combine all the dependencies, we make a transitive closure over those dependencies, and the advantage of taking all the transitive closures of dependencies is, once I modify A, I have to do once the job of finding everything that potentially must be recomputed. Enfin, not potentially, that must be recomputed and potentially is modified, actually. And the advantage of doing this job once for all direct and indirect fields is that doing it once, essentially, you can group the queries necessary for determining which records to recompute. And grouping everything together essentially reduces the number of queries. And you will find, for instance, so Fabien's example, you had the total of a sales order depends on the subtotal of the sale order lines. And the subtotal of the sale order lines may depend on the price list on the sales order. When you look at this, in fact, the total of the sales order actually depends on the price list on the sales order itself. And in fact, if you look at this, you realize you don't have to, when I change the price list, I don't have to go to the lines and then go back to the sales order to realize you have to compute the total of the sale order. I can do right away, I'm on the sale order, I know that on the same sale order, I have to recompute the total. And essentially, when you combine all the dependency paths, so you make the transitive closure of the dependencies, you will find field traversals, and some of these are actually kind of idempotent. Therefore, they go back to the original record. So I make a typical example. It's typically you traverse a one-to-many field, and then you traverse the inverse of that one-to-many field. You can only go back to the record, to the initial record. And so you're simplifying, in fact, here, the dependencies. And that allows for a simpler way to trigger recomputations again. You may save queries doing that. That thing is a very, it's a Fabien's idea, this one. Assume you have a line that depends, so it's a field foo, so you can think of it as a subtotal. Foo is subtotal and bar is the price list. So the subtotal of a line depends on the price list on the sales order. And so line IDs, it's a one-to-many based on an inverse field order ID. When you modify bar on the sales order, you have two ways to retrieve which lines to recompute. You can either search for those lines, which was the former way of doing it, or actually, instead of searching those lines, you see the domain here. In fact, if you go to the implementation, if you go to the implementation of the one-to-many field, you will find the exact same query. Therefore, what we do is simply follow the one-to-many field, and the one-to-many field will give you all the impacted lines. It's only valid, of course, if there is no domain on the one-to-many field. So the one-to-many is just an inverse of a many-to-one field. And the good case is that, at worst, the second case will do the exact same query as before. At best, the value is already in cache and it costs nothing. You just read what you have in cache, and that's it. So again, we save queries by doing that. And typically, when you modify these kind of objects, the probability for the one-to-many being in cache is actually pretty high. And this one, this was my idea, in fact. So assume you have a model that has a field with a dependency which is partner ID.name. you create a new partner record, and then typically the recomputation triggers, they will do what? They will try to find which record in the model M depends on this new record. And it will try to find the records R that satisfy this equality. And can you guess? So all these things, smart triggers, they just impact performance. They have in fact no impact on the correction of your code. So it has no impact on you, except it goes better. It just goes better. Here I'll do a kind of challenge. You have here, a field contact ID that depends on the field partner ID. Okay, assume they're both many plus partner, and contact ID is computed and stored in database. If you have that input method, you see, I assign contact ID only if the partner ID is not known. Not false, whatever. What would be the value of contact ID if partner ID on the record was empty? False, exactly. In version 12, when you don't assign a field, in fact, it's explicitly even pre-assigned to false. And therefore, as a consequence, there's no way in a compute method to know the former value of that field, of the computed field. There's no way. We made a change to that. And there are several reasons. The change is it's no longer false by default. So if you don't assign a field, the meaning is it remains to the same value. It keeps its value. So you can say
Here, actually, I don't really have to recompute the field. It can keep its former value. You can even do more than that. You can even, in the compute value, read the value of the field on the record you're just computing. And you'll get its current value before you recompute it somehow. So you can even do kind of an incremental recomputation, where the recomputation incrementally does something on the former value. Of course, that only makes sense for stored fields. Because when you're accessing a field, you're executing its compute method. And if after executing its compute method, or while you're computing its compute method, you're still trying to access the field, the fallback is to go back to look up, to fetch the value from the database. Of course, means the field has to be in the database to have a former value. An unstored field, when you send a request, doesn't have a former value. Okay? Therefore, and this was actually most of the bugs we had to fix when we changed the ORM were this one. Essentially, there were compute methods with an if, and essentially implicitly assigning a field, a computed field to false, and we just had to add the else record blah 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 to quote false. So if the field is not stored, you have to be explicit, always, just like always recompute it from scratch. Okay? Now we can go even further. The trick is here, we're recomputing a field. In fact, the only thing that changed between this one and this one is here. I added read-only or false. So when you define a computed field, by default, it's read-only. That's the meaning, it's just like a formula in Excel. Okay? You're not supposed to override its value. Here, it's not read-only, which means it can be computed, but you can override the value. And that's more or less what unchanged methods are for. Essentially, it's providing you a value for a field, but you can actually put any value you want to that field. You're not forced to take the one that's somehow computed for you. So here, what it tells, if you have on a form those two fields, partner and contact, when you change the partner and you select an actual partner, the contact field will be set to the former one. But as the field is not read-only, you can actually change that value. And then we have a rule that says, so to assume that B is the contact ID field, while A is the partner ID field. So B is computed, stored, and not read-only, and it depends on B, on A, sorry. The rule is you recompute the fields B only if one of its dependencies has been modified and the field B itself has not been set originally. Okay? So if you write just on the dependency, you recompute the field automatically. If you write on the field itself, you just write on the field. There's no computation, whatever. And if you write on the dependency and the field itself, then there's no recomputation. The value you give is taken as the value, the final value of the field. And the slight difference here is that it works for unchanges. The compute method used to work automatically as unchanges. And here, it worked as unchanged, but it also worked automatically in create and write. Therefore, it's kind of an unchanged that kind of works in every situation. It works in every place somehow where the business needs it. And this is what we will frequently see in our code at least, and I suspect you probably have the same yourself, for yourself. You have unchanged methods because they are very convenient and they don't force a particular value. It's typically just a helper for a user. And it's quite frequent that you have something that looks like this code in the create method. And you say, okay, I have a field B. If no value is given for the field B, I will compute it from the field A. And in the good case, you're trying to reuse the code of your onChange that performs the same operation. In the worst case, you're just kind of copy-paste the code or rewrite it in a different way, and then you end up with the problem of maintaining those two things consistent. And in some cases, you do it even in the right method. Here, if you use a compute for expressing that, you'll get the 3 right away. See? There's a question, yes?
Will this work with dotted fields? Because unchanged decorator, you cannot traverse relations.
Yes, it works with dotted fields.
So you can have a field on the same order line which depends on order ID, not whatever you want.
Yeah, it works. Now, yet another thing. There's actually this task is not completely finished yet. But most of it is already implemented. There's a little bit missing, and we're kind of finalizing the. Okay, there was a bit of a rush, and we found some issues with it. So we remade, this is a pure, I'm going to start with a pure functional statement. We remade the widget that allows you to switch from one company to another and possibly select several companies, like if you want to see records from several companies at once. You're kind of activating companies for your web client. We tried to rationalize the behavior of that widget such that you can select one company, which means I'm just working in company A or company B or company C, or you're saying like, I want to see, in fact, all the records of companies A, B, C, and do something in the context of company A, but possibly combining records of company B and C. Okay? The way we do that is the widget modifies the context of the request being made by the web client, and it introduces a key called allowed company IDs. The name is pretty clear. And the value of that widget is a list of company IDs. Okay? Straight simple. We've added 2 properties, on the environment object, one of them called company, and the other called companies. Companies is just the browse record set, in fact, corresponding to these allowed company IDs. There's an extra check because we should not allow you to, let's say, search for objects in companies you're not allowed to by configuration of your user. So it checks that allowed company IDs is a subset of the companies of the user. So every user has a predefined set of companies it can work with. And then it has its current company. Essentially, so the allowed company IDs must be a subset of these companies. And the main use of this property, those companies, is for the accessibility of records. So we rewrote the access rules for most records to use these allowed company IDs. Okay? The second one, Untitled company, it's the main company. So if you want to create, let's say, accounting entries, they will be for that company, not the other ones. That company. And we made a convention, instead of having two keys in the context, we have only one key, the list. And the first element in the list is the main company. Okay? This is just convention. So the widget allows you to select all the companies you want to see and which one is the main one. And in the context, that one will appear as the first one. Okay? So company is essentially the first record in the record set companies. And it's the semantics that is given, it's the main company of the request, or the requests. So that's the main target. As I said, it's the target company for doing any kind of business process. And it also aims at replacing, for instance, the force company key you have in the context. And that's used, for instance, for accessing company-independent fields, and in many places for doing any kind of business stuff. Okay? So the aim is to replace these things, is to use just one concept for all. There are also keys, company ID and stuff like that. There will probably some leftovers, because changing everything is tricky, especially after the release. But that's it. We have a bit of support, not much support. So the company dependent field will depend on Untitled company. Okay? You have, as I mentioned before, if a computed field depends on the main company, you just you add the decorator depends context and you put company as the keyword. And this has a special meaning. It will actually take Untitled company instead of accessing, getting the key company in the context. Okay? So this is a special meaning. And we have this new method. This part hasn't been committed yet, but will soon be. With company, it does what you think it does. Essentially, you give it a company ID or a company record, and what it does is return you the same record set, but with a different environment. It's actually updating the context, allowed company IDs, in such a way that the first company is the one you gave in parameter, and the list of companies is the same if the company was already in the set, or the same plus the company you gave if it was not in the set. So if I wrote it as record set equalities, that's what you get. Okay? Essentially, with company, kind of switches which one of your companies becomes the main company. And it may or not belong to the allowed company IDs you were given in the request. That's a summary of all I've just presented. A certain number of changes were essentially, let's say, just programming improvement, like the Superuser mode, the multi-company support, and the compute, the small changes in the compute methods. I think the compute is probably the one that will bother you the most. If you're used to putting some ifs in compute methods and not assigning the value of a field all the time, you may get some trouble. Okay? But besides that, it should be relatively fine. And the right-hand side changes, those ones were actually motivated by performance. So, simplifying the cache, doing less cache invalidation, and instead of invalidating the cache, trying to update it For instance, you're changing a many-to-one field, and or let's say you're creating a new partner, and that partner is a child record of another partner. When you're creating the child record, you're setting the many-to-one field to the parent record, and the parent record has a one-to-many field that's the exact inverse. In Odoo 12, we were invalidating the one-to-many field. Therefore, if you want to read that one-to-many field, you have to fetch it from the database. Here, instead, we update the value immediately in cache. And therefore, we don't have to fetch it again from the database. It has a small change that may be visible, is that when we add a new element to a one-to-many field, the one-to-many fields have an implicit order, which is the order on their co-model. When we update a value in cache, we don't respect that order, just for performance reasons. We don't reorder everything, because reordering potentially costs errors. So if you rely on the order, be careful, it might not be the right order. If you just rely on the content as a set, then it's fine. Okay? But by doing less cache invalidations and doing cache updates instead, we get, of course, less cache misses and therefore less needs for extra queries. Delaying the recomputations essentially leads to more batching in the recomputations. So for simple recompute method, it might not change anything. But for larger ones, some compute methods take advantage of recomputing for a large set for making, let's say, one query on the database that fetches all the results efficiently in just one query. When you are in that situation, of course, delaying the recomputation is an advantage because you get more stuff to recompute at once. And the delayed updates, with the case when you have fields to recompute on one record, typically all the fields will be saved as one updated database. And of course, the change to the recomputation triggers, which saves many queries, especially at creation of records. And that's it. Yes? You have a microphone for
Peut-être répéter la question après, si tu sais.
yeah. So the question is, what's the implication on the website about these changes? There's no direct implication for websites, as far as I know. Most of the website is about rendering pages and then doing a bit of business work. But for rendering pages, it won't change much, I think.
Does he repeat the questions? Huh? Does he repeat the questions? Est-ce qu'il répète les questions? Merci.
So the question was about the caching. So be careful here. The cache I was talking about is what we call the record cache. It contains the value of the feeds of the records, and it lasts just the time of the transaction. Okay? We have other caches which actually last longer, and it lasts across requests. And it's typically when you're rendering a QWeb view. Before rendering it, you have to build the final view from the view. So you have an architecture, and then you're applying inheritance and stuff like that. And then the result is put in a cache. And that cache may be reused actually several requests later. That cache is not impacted at all by that. It's totally independent from that. And I suppose this is the cache you mentioned. Yeah. Okay. This has no impact. Right? It's just good as a form. Just that. Yeah. What about XML RPC scripts or programs? Essentially, there's no change for those ones. There's no change because, I mean, all the things I've talked here about are about how the business code is executed and the CRUD methods and so on. So there's no direct impact on the remote code, which essentially relies on APIs. And those APIs haven't changed. Yeah? One last question.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, the compute method is triggered with write. And the unchanged was directly updating the field in the view even before saving. Is there a solution for now, or no? We need to save to see the new value.
So the question, I hope everyone understood the question, is that the compute method is triggered by a write or a create, or sometimes a link. And what about the unchanged? Should we do something special for it to work in the unchanged? In fact, the way it works is when you trigger a compute, you trigger a recomputation, you mark a field to be recomputed on a record. When you access that field, it's actually recomputed and its result is stored in cache. And it's not stored immediately on the database. Storing it on the database is done by the flush method. In the case of an unchanged, in fact, it's like you will never flush. You will just recompute in cache, but not flush. Therefore, the compute methods, they work pretty well with unchanged, but just like in version 12, in fact.
Yeah, but will they be triggered and show us the value without clicking on the save button?
Yes, they will be triggered automatically. Actually, it used to work before. So if B depends on A, when you modify A in the form view, B is automatically recomputed in the form view. Okay, it used to work and it still works. In fact, the ORM kind of tells the web client which fields should trigger an unchanged. And it's typically the fields for which you have either an unchanged method with unchanged the name of the field, or a compute method, a computed field, that depends on that field. Okay? Thank you. I have to stop here. Don't worry, I'll be around tomorrow and on Friday if you have more questions. Thank you very much. The name of the field, or a compute method, a computed field, that depends on that field. Okay? Thank you. I have to stop here. Don't worry, I'll be around tomorrow and on Friday if you have more questions. Thank you very much. The name of the field, or a compute method, a computed field, that depends on that field. Okay? Thank you. I have to stop here. Don't worry, I'll be around tomorrow and on Friday if you have more questions. Thank you very much. The name of the field, or a compute method, a computed field, that depends worry, I'll be around tomorrow and on Friday if you have more questions. Thank you very much. The name of the field, or a compute method, a computed field that depends on that field. Okay? Thank you. I have to stop here. Don't worry, I'll be around tomorrow and on Friday if you have more questions. Thank you very much. The name of the field, or a compute method, a computed field that depends on that field. Okay? Thank you. I have to stop here. Don't worry, I'll be around tomorrow and on Friday if you have more questions. Thank you very much. The name of the field, or a compute method, a computed field that depends on that field. Okay? Thank you. I have to stop here. Don't worry, I'll be around tomorrow and on Friday if you have more questions. Thank you very much. My name is Tobias, and I am the managing director of OBS Solutions. We are a gold partner, and I'm very happy and glad to be able to present you one of our recent projects we've done in the last months together with AH Industries. And I will not do the talking, so I'm very happy to introduce Henrik Platz from AH Industries. He was part of the team leading this project. And yeah, he will guide you a bit through the presentation and through what we've done in the last month.
Merci à toi.
At least I'll try. We have a series of slides. I will make a short introduction to the company, tell about our special needs, what we solve for our special needs, and then how we solve them in Odoo, and then what was bad, what could we have done differently, and what was good in our way of doing it. And already now this is not changing when I push the keys. Who would expect that? I find that. Now it's working. Well, okay, so. Yeah, it's just about you up. That's why you have a good gold card. We actually just spoke about this because it happened to me a couple of years ago. Yeah. Well. Yeah. All the pictures on the left are pictures of products that we have or things from our factory. Just to explain the little picture of our products and our customers. A small picture of what we do. We have 4 locations, 4 production locations. 3 in Denmark, 1 in China. And besides that, we have 4 financial companies, estate companies, holding companies, and this stuff. So it's in fact a multi-company, 8 companies we have end up having this setup. What we do is we machine steel and metal components from very small parts to rotor houses that we ship both offshore and onshore, and a lot of other stuff. But it's metal parts, big and small. We tried a lot of different markets, wind, marine, and whatever you can read on the slide. And jumping very fast to what we saw were our special needs, or not saw, but we decided before we went into this project. In this business, it's very important to have the full traceability, not only on serial number from supplier to the customer, but also on quality documentation, drawings, manufacturing instructions, and whatever. That changes from time to time. All that we produce, that is made to order. We have no finished goods on stock. It's only made to order. And if, for example, Siemens order a rotor house today, it's the same serial number, it's the same description, it's the same material they order. But if they order one more next week, it could be a separate drawing, new drawing. But we cannot see the difference, but they can. So for us it's very important to have this full documentation. We do also a lot of subcontracting, sourcing our production out to subcontractors. That could be one manufacturing order can consist of, for example, 5 work orders. And we reorder some of these, and we also sometimes subcontract one of the work orders out of house. And all the big items we send out for surface treatment, painting in the end. So we have subcontracting in this. And the flexible manufacturing, that's where we change the order of our work orders. We have an internal shop where the operators in the production, they can take oil, tools, gloves, safety shoes, clothes, a lot of stuff are needed in the production. So they go in and pick this out of this, and all these 4,000 materials, they are storable products. They have a separate location. So we need to have full traceability, who picked them, when they picked it, and make sure we have them on stock, otherwise production stops. So it's important for us, these 4,000 materials. We need some integration with other systems, especially for the bank, time registration, the salary systems. And then we are from Denmark, so we use the Anglo-Saxon accounting. For those who have never heard about Anglo-Saxon accounting, be happy. It's a mess. And Odoo says it's ready for that, but it doesn't work. A lot of stories about that, but it's not relevant for this case. We have plus 100 supplier invoices per day, so we have a lot of flow of invoices through our system,
and we need to make sure we can handle that without allocating 1 or 2 managers to approve invoices. We do a lot of calculations before or after we run production and sales orders. That's also important. And as you saw at the drawing before, multi-currency, multi-company, multi-language, multi-everything. A lot of mess. Before we went live with this, or decided to go in this project, we had 3 versions of Microsoft Navision from 2009. That's 10 years ago, unchanged. And we had a lot of Excel, a lot of paperwork doing manually. So going into Odoo, that was really also not just changing an IT system, but also changing the culture. It's like telling my mother-in-law to go from the old Nokia to the newest iPhone. She would never manage. That's the same we did in the production. And we had a very tight timeline because we needed to for a lot of good reasons. The way we decided to do this, because we had, to be honest, a big issue with our accounting people. They are not able to speak anything but Danish. Not because they are accountants, but just that. We decided to go with Odoo Business Solution, Tobias and his people sitting somewhere there, doing the, you can say, all of it. They own the installation, they do all the updates and upgrades, they do everything. And then we have for the financial part, Odoo House from Denmark. They know about the Anglo-Saxon method. They can speak with our finance people. They know about the Danish regulations and so on. So it was more convenient for us. There are no localization for a Danish company in Odoo. So that's why we choose the Danish one. These are the apps we run, covering the full process from purchase to the sales and the CRM module, and added the internal shop, quality module, barcode scanning for our internal shop, because the operators going pick these 4,000 materials. That's important that they pick the right one. Otherwise, we end up getting quality problems with our supplier, our customers. Sorry. We also run the loan accounting, the last one, or the most important for me, at least. I'm the controller. So this was the setup. For doing this, as I said, we had a tight timeline. And because we didn't want to throw a bomb in the factory or in the company, we decided that we would go for the one factory. Start with the most simple factory, put Odoo in there, and let's do that and see how it works. And when we are satisfied, then we continue. So we picked the most simple factory. We called it that. We found out it wasn't that simple. And then we decided we would not extend before we were at 95%. However you will measure that. But when our stomach feeling will say we are 95%, then we extend. And that we plan to do in 2 months or something. We had the proof of concept 1 year ago. That was the first time I saw Odoo in real life. 1 year ago. And then we had a launch of the project in March, and we decided to go live with 12th of June. That's 3.5 months. That's pretty fast. In fact, if you think, we had the Easter and a lot of spring holidays in that period, so we didn't have more than 2.5 months, in fact, working. But going from project launch to go live at a factory, running 24/7. So it has been a tough job, but we are more or less there now. We sat down and our project team in the factory, 3 people allocated from 50 to 100% of their time. Karen sitting there from supply, myself from accounting, and then our IT manager doing the accounting stuff. And then we teamed up with consultants from OBS. We have been working very close together during this process, and we teamed up with consultants from the Odoo House on the accounting part. So we had a good team, and we had a lot of power in the organization. The top management gave us more or less free hands to make all needed decisions. So we could decide to change all processes if you would like to. So we could make big decisions, and that was nice. Then we went through our special needs, talked with OBS about that, and we ended up finding out that most of our special needs related to the serial numbers were Odoo standard. Well, something with views and something with finding the right stock location and where they are. But that's just a setup, that's just changing views. It's still Odoo standard. What was also standard was that our needs for changing the process from the old Nokia to the new mobile phone, to the new iPhone, changing the way people were working in the old edition, Excel sheets, paper, emails, all that, taking so much of their time. That was also, of course, Odoo standard, changing that. Then we had the next thing that we found out could be used pretty close to Odoo standard. That's in the internal shop with our 4,000 materials. We have one guy, in fact 2 people, employee, their only job is to ensure that these 4,000 materials are available 24/7. They need to be there, otherwise we stop production. And it was pretty close to standard, the solution we have now. Behind the screen, what they did was they made a new screen, a new interface, so the users had something simple to do, but all the stuff, most of the stuff behind are standard. The accounting part, more or less standard. We still need to take something out, put it in Excel, do some work and all that. But I've just been to the Anglo-Saxon presentation, the one 1 hour ago. That was also the conclusion from Odoo. You still need to do Excel. So we do it. But that's pretty close to standard. It's not Odoo, but it's very close to standard. Then we have some programming, real customization. Flexible routing, as I said, we move the work orders around for good reasons, also some bad reasons, but we do it. That requires programming. Subcontracting within manufacturing orders, when we move work orders around, sometimes we move them out to a subcontractor because we lack capacity. Take them back and continue working at our own. It's not Odoo standard. But we can do that now. Yes. They are not. Yes, we can do that now. And then we had the last thing that we found out was needed. It was not a surprise, but something we found out. We needed to change more or less all our processes from the old Nokia to the new iPhone. We needed to change the culture, we needed to change the people. And looking at that list, this list, it's what we all know before we start. The fewest points requires the most work. We spend most of the time on the system-related stuff. Cool, IT-wise, we are happy. We forgot a bit about the people. Because that's really, it's really an explosion at their factory, in their mind, because they need to do everything in another way. Or fostering use. So that was a challenge for us. We should put focus on it. And what have been our learnings in running a project like this in real life, 2.5 months? Because now the next plan is we are, I think in a month we would say we are 90% in Odoo at the first factory. And we still miss the 5%. So that's why I say 2 months, perhaps 3, will go live at the next factory. But we need to be ready. And what should we do before we do that? What should we change? The top one. I said it was a good thing that the project team, we had a lot of power. We could change whatever we would like, was more or less the telling. But we forgot to involve the users in that process. So when we came out of our closed room with our new design system and said, now see what we have for you, they didn't know what it was. Next time we will involve operative users more at earlier stage. It's not rocket science, you know that everybody, but we forget it and we forgot it. We will change that for the next Not that we failed, no, we are running, but it could be better. Be more detailed in the proof of concept phase. We had a very short period where we more or less just tried, can we create orders, can we sell, can we produce? Yes, we can, and of course we could. We should have been more detailed, saying what were our special needs, and have them to show us that you do that next time. We probably, due to all this history, all the telling, we underestimated the accounting part. We decided we cannot play with the accounting part before we had the full ready running system. But with that tight schedule we had, it was hard to have a full running system before go live and then play in accounting. So accounting more or less just started after go live. Was a challenge. Still is. That we will change for the next time. We will be more ready. On our way, we found out, even though it was a very short period, we went live mid-June. Now we are 3.5 months later. Yeah, 3.5 months later. We still have tasks to solve. Of course we have. From the beginning, we did not have a shared common operating task list. That we will change. Because then it's so much easier to speak with each other. This task number 75, what are the status, what were the dates, what were the decisions, what were the agreements, and have that shared. Again, it's common sense, but we forget because we just start looking at the system, start working, we are happy it's going good. Next time we'll do that. Share this task list. Focusing on converting data. When I'm saying converting data, it's not materials, it's not customers, suppliers, payment terms, whatever. That's standard. It's just do it. Take it out of the old system. Watch the data, load them in. It worked. It was quite easy. It was a lot of job cleaning from three systems, merging together and putting into one system and shared database. Of course, that required a lot of work. Because we just do it, we know how to do it. The problem was running purchase order, open sales orders, running manufacturing orders, and whatever we had in the old systems. Because we decided to close the old system, start a new engine, turn it on, now we're running. And then we asked the people to create the running purchase orders, create the running sales orders, create the running manufacturing order, and continue from there in Odoo. But we missed the link from the old system. So when we, for example, simple thing, get a supplier invoice for purchase we asked for in the old system. Then we get the invoice in Odoo, but the accountant doesn't know the purchase order number, so we cannot match the two things. So we just book it. So we have a lot of open purchase orders which we haven't paid, which we haven't got invoices for. But at the same time, we have paid a lot of bills. So cleaning that up, having that mess, we will change that next time. And then the last thing, again, spend more time on training people, telling them about the new culture, what will happen. Not just tell them, involve them, make sure they understand. That's again something we lack. We will change that next time. Of course, it's easier now because now we have a running Odoo system in our factory. We can invite them to that factory and say, see people, this is what you get, be happy. We need to make sure the people we have on board now are happy before we tell them that. So these are, you could say, the learnings, the things that we will change for next time. But by saying that, of course, we also had success. We went live with the system in 2.5 months, and we produced, we delivered orders, we sent invoices, we got our money, and even the suppliers got their money. So everybody was happy, except the users, because we forgot the users. But the management were happy until they were told that the users were not happy, then they are also not happy. But what was good? We ran the project in sprints. For those who don't know what a sprint is, you meet the project team and the consultants discuss what's important to do, decide this is the most important thing, go home, do something, come back, tell us what you've done, show it, and we decide it's good or it's bad. That's one sprint. So you can have a lot of sprints, but doing like this, saying now we focus on 2 or 3 tasks, and we go home, work intensive in 10 days, come back, show the bill, show the work, show the animal, what have we done. We did that, and the consultants were there before the sprint, in between the sprints, after the sprints, they were there at go live, they have been there sometimes afterwards when we have decided now it's time for us to meet. And they just not show up and ask us what to do and then do what we say. No, they ask questions to understand our business. And that's really, for us, has been a good thing because for us we needed to change so many processes, so many things because Odoo is integrated system. So when we run in Odoo, then we are sure that our processes follow the fine tuning in Odoo, but very different from the old processes. So the Odoo partners we had in, they were willing to ask questions, understand our business, and try to adapt that into Odoo. And that was good, and that's why we will continue with them for the next projects also. I say projects, continue the projects for the rest of the company. Also, speed and confidence. We are in a situation sometimes after this, we have problems, we face something that does not work, we send an email to OBS saying we have this, and we get answers. Sometimes immediately, but always in a very short period, we, within a day, get the answer. I've got your email, I have this suggestion for solution, or I have not time until tomorrow morning, is that okay, or should I find somebody to help me? We know that they are there. It's not just a computer sending us an email back saying, yes, we have received your email, we will answer you when we are ready. No, we get real answers from real people, from OBS and also, in fact, from Odoo House. I promise not to say that because they are here, but that is. So what was good was we worked together with our consultants. That was really good. And then it was good that we were 3 people that had all the mandates to change processes, because we didn't have to have a lot of big meetings, discussion, and all that in common. We could just say, yes, that's a good solution, go for that. And then people had to say yes. They didn't, but they had to. And you could say the last 2 points, also very important. We didn't go for 100% perfect solution in Odoo, because we knew we couldn't afford that. We didn't have the money to pay for 100% solution. And only going for 80% was good enough, because after go live, you always face something you need to change. So we decided go for 80%, then go live, and then change what we need. That was our way of doing this. And then the last thing, what was good, there has been a good collaboration between our 2 Odoo partners. And also, we think at least with us. But there has been no bad feelings, no nothing. We have had no issues with having 2 Odoo partners in house. This has really worked good. So, good things, bad things. You spent 2.5 months, then you went live, then you have been working since then. So that was very short, 22 minutes about our history. And I think Tobias would like to say something.
Yes, I would like to.
Yeah, come on, say something.
Thank you very much, Henrik, for your presentation. I don't want to bother you long. Before we go into question and answer, I'd like to present a bit based on what we just heard. What's our philosophy at OBS and how we think about Odoo? What's very important for us is, and that's actually in line with the Odoo SA strategy generally, we think Odoo is a great tool, of course, and we can do a lot with existing modules with configuration. So what we like to do, and we in the project phase, we are always on the side of using as much as possible Odoo standard with its possibilities before we go into customization. knowing, of course, that with Odoo we can adapt a lot of things. Yeah, I said already, we have very strong cooperation with Odoo. On bigger projects we work together, and then of course we have as well exclusive access to certain resources if we need very specialized people, and so on. And what we do as well is we only work on Odoo. We don't work on other ERP systems or anything, because we believe if you want to do something very good, you have to focus. You have to focus on things in order to be good. And therefore we do Odoo. Of course we help in integration with other software, but we focus on Odoo. Yeah, if you see here, there's a few project examples. And actually we have no dedicated industry, so our projects are in various industries, manufacturing, sales, e-commerce, IT service industries. And our customers are as well very diverse, so we have customer startups that are fast growing, we have customers or companies that are long in business, change from one system to another. And while we have small customers, we have bigger customers. We tend to focus a bit on the, for Odoo, bigger SMEs. Yeah, and normally we implement the system in full, so CRM, ERP, web, depending on what the customer needs, but a full company software. But we have, that I would like to mention specifically, we have as well some special solutions here too, which show a bit the capability of Odoo and how we work with them. One is Angry. Angry is a daughter company to BMW, and they had a very specific need in the inventory process. So the inventory process had to be exactly how they needed this. And what we've done is, in the front end, we have customized this, but the back end, all movements in the inventory were Odoo standard. So we could use a lot of Odoo standard, even though for the customer, he thinks, or he sees a big development because it's 100% made for them. Well, and the second example is the company eSolutions. It's a daughter company to Audi. They work on infotainment systems for the Audi group. And they use only the fleet management system of Odoo with Odoo Studio. And well, we had quite a big competition. So there were fleet management software providers competing with us. We actually the fleet management app, as you know, is just a very small app in Odoo, but they decided for Odoo because of its adaptability. So we could as well here, they needed some fields, some views, and we could actually provide everything here on a very, very low budget. And we won that against specialized systems. So, well, if you sum up here, so our normal projects are CRM, ERP implementations, so implementations of company software in companies up to, I would say, 600-700 employees. But as well as, especially for bigger companies, specific solutions if they need a certain demand. So Odoo is actually good for both, but like 95-90% all businesses in that area. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. Don't know whether you have any questions, and we are of course very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Please, just repeat the questions. Just repeat the questions, okay?
What?
Just repeat the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
The question was why was it changed to Odoo? Why did it change? What? Yes, why agent is to choose Odoo?
Yeah, why we choose Odoo? That's in fact something that happened before the project team came in the company. We needed to change because the service agreements and the update agreements on our old Microsoft provision ran out. So we couldn't use the old system anymore. We couldn't get support anywhere, so it would be closed. So we needed to do something. And to be honest, one of the things that were important was the price. Odoo is very expensive compared to Microsoft ERP, for example. But why we ended in Odoo was in fact something our old IT who found Odoo and made a lot of work trying to say, yes, that can solve our problems. But then, when we went live, we left the company. Or just after the proof of concept, to be honest. So
But I didn't leave the company because of Odoo.
we don't know. You didn't ask. You didn't ask. So. Oh, that's only you could talk about that because we are 3 people in the project to read this program.
Yeah, repeat the question.
How many people are working in this?
Two questions actually. I would be interested about the budget of the project and how many people are working to inherit the software.
So the question was about the budget of the project, and the other question was about how many people are working operatively against Visual. Yeah? So it's actually, well, there's one location live. How many people are there?
In total, there are 60, 70 people or something. We have white collar people. I think they are 15 people. We have all the accounting departments, and then we are 9 people working in Odoo for that factory, and then in addition for the other factories. So we have close to 70 people working, not constantly because they do manufacturing, but they use Odoo to create the time confirm production hours. And project-wise, to be honest, I don't have the figures. But you can get my card and then you can.
There's another question about the change management process. You mentioned that it's quite important to take the people within the project. Could you give us a few examples how you did it and what was wrong actually during this program?
We were at a situation where we were quite stressed order-wise. We had a lot of things to do at the factory. And when we made an agreement with the old factory manager, who also left the company, the old factory manager and the steering group, that it was okay that the 3 people in the project team were representing all the factory. Well knowing that we didn't know about all the details. And that's of course super wrong decision. Now I say super because we need to do that in this. But we did.
Thank you.
Otherwise, you can have my card and send me an email, ask questions after this meeting.